I mean, don't forget, moments ago, he was denying this part of it, saying you were a crazy madman for saying this. Now he realized he was wrong. Now he gives you partial admission. This should be insulting.
The things that, I'll be honest with you, surprised me. When I did your show in person, afterwards, I said, mate, now that we're good mates, how about you unblock me on Twitter? And you went, oh, I've blocked you on Twitter. And I went, yeah, I took the piss out of you over COVID. And that's when you surprised me, because you went, yeah, I deserved it.
Yeah.
I did not expect that, actually, given your public persona.
I've changed my mind on a few things with COVID because the science changed.
Nope. Not even remotely. I said the science didn't change, though. All this really reveals is that he trusted what he was told the science was, not the actual science that outlets like T-Lab were exposing throughout. Most importantly, that they never stopped transmission and that they knew this, then covered it up.
So I'll give you an example. And I'm quite happy to admit this and talk about it. And people are like,
you wouldn't have been dragged into saying this in 2023 if you were happy to admit it. It's been the same way for 2 years, bud.
Welcome to The Independent Review, a weekly podcast where we bring you the latest from the world of independent journalism. Whether you're a news junkie, a curious learner, or just looking for a fresh perspective away from the corporate media, this is the show for you. So join us now as we dive into the world of independent journalism on The Independent Review.
Welcome to the Independent Review. This week, we will take a look at some clips from Ryan Cristián of The Last American Vagabond, Whitney, Webb, and Johnny Vedmore on the Children's Health Defense, and Derrick Broze with an update on the child sexual abuse investigation in Utah.
Now, here is something you may have seen. We were just talking about this. You had these Orthodox Christian Ukrainian churches that were standing up and saying, that, because I mean, you probably saw it. Of course, you didn't hear that from CNN or Fox or any of the corporate media, because they obviously care about religious rights, or they don't at all, and they lie about it all the time. Only care when their enemies do something. They didn't say a word about what was happening to these priests. The Ukraine stood up and basically sent down a mandate that these places couldn't exist anymore. Sort of like Israel's now demanding that you're not allowed to speak the name of Jesus or believe, or rather just preach the word of Jesus Christ in Israel. Because democracy and freedom and all the stuff, they swear that's what they're trying to do. No, they're lying to you. The point is, in Ukraine, they just physically removed and shut down these priests and their churches. I mean, this is what you're supporting when you stand with Ukraine. Think about laying your hands on a priest because he's a priest in a church think about that. Man. They're inside the church right now, guys. The point is, according to Zelensky and the neo-Nazi element, you're just not allowed to practice Christianity, apparently. We literally just played the clip of them speaking. And they were all standing there saying, we will not back down. We will stand, we support what they're doing. And it's just that it doesn't matter what justification. Ukrainian religious persecution, the arrest of Orthodox priests continue, including inside holy places. Think about how much this overlaps with Israel and how Ukraine, even by Zelensky's own word, said that Ukraine now is the big Israel. That's what they're all. This is not it's as simple as it looks, guys. These are criminal people that are doing terrible things and just acting like they're good people doing good things. This is not religious freedom. This is the opposite of that. And yet the U.S. government and everybody else is going to scream. They're doing what they're fighting for, all the great reset, SGD and all, trans rights and woke politics. They'll say all of that, sure, as they do anything they want with your money. Like there's this thing going around about one of these individuals that's constantly saying they need more money from the U.S. government, and his picture of a brand new Rolls Royce, right? It's happening all over the place. Now, here's an interesting, important clip shared by Glenn Greenwald, which I think is really interesting, about Chris Murphy on the record saying exactly what we've always been telling you, that they were extensively involved with the regime change in 2014. But we should know this by now, because it's an obvious reality. It's only narrative that stops people from realizing how clear this is.
Crushed it. And so here we are in Kiev telling them if they do the same, we're going to support a change of government, which we then engineered and picked their president. Now, at the time, Chris Murphy, who again is a young senator, he was 39 when he was elected, just like a year earlier. He went on C-SPAN to talk about his role with John McCain in engineering all kinds of instability in Ukraine and trying to work with the Republicans and other Democrats in the administration to change the government of Ukraine. And he made some amazing admissions that are really worth watching in retrospect. Let's watch a couple of those.
I will admit to you that I have not been involved in what's happening in Venezuela over the last week, because I've been focused as the chairman of the Europe subcommittee on Ukraine. But
time off from trying to change the government in Venezuela, he was a little bit absent from that, he said, because he was so focused instead on changing the government in Ukraine.
With respect to Ukraine, we have not sat on the sidelines. We have been very much involved.
And don't forget that NATO just said on the record, I mean, Stoltenberg, whether he was accidental or not, that, yeah, we've been helping since 2014 with everything. When we said that at the beginning of this, crazy fake news, all the corporate media, like, how long until the average person gets hip to how clear and obvious this continues to be? Fake, crazy, fake news, not true, misinformation. And then 10 seconds later, they're saying some form of the same thing over and over and over.
Members of the Senate who have been there, members of the State Department who have been on the square. The Obama administration passed sanctions. The Senate was prepared to pass its own set of sanctions. And as I said, I really think that the clear position of the United States has in part been what has helped lead to this change in regime. So,
I mean, did you hear what he said there? We have not been on the sidelines. We have been very active there. And our active role played a key role in the change of regimes, meaning we helped topple the democratic government, the democratically elected government in Ukraine, and replaced it with one chosen by Victoria Nuland. It's just an explicit admission.
And you guys know this because you watch this show. And I played the clip 100,000 times about her literally on the phone discussing who will be elected in the democracy. And it's just so stupid that anybody doesn't like. And this is my point about today, is why I think most people can see this. It's a combination of them maybe not realizing that that everybody else also sees it, and the fact that people just are playing team sport politics. They just really don't want to see it. Now, here's a really important example going back to 21st Century Wire, which again is a platform that I don't point out, shout out enough. And the point, this is really like the overlap here with the timing of it. So in 2014, the reality is that the U.S. government was 100% involved, entirely engineering the regime change. And we have on the record, maybe I shall just play the very first part of that clip. Because it's important to see the statement he makes. And then I could play the McCain and Lindsey Graham, again, them speaking to them in 2017, saying, your war is our war. It's so clear.
On February 20th of 2013, the world was shocked by video footage of snipers firing on protesters in Kiev, Ukraine. 21 people were murdered, and it was widely assumed that President Viktor Yanukovych and his supporters were behind the attacks. However, a phone conversation between EU Foreign Policy Chief Cathy Ashton and Estonia's Foreign Minister Urmas Paet, which was leaked to the public on March 5th, reveals that the snipers were actually from the new coalition government, and that Western diplomats knew this and covered it up.
Yeah. So that he has some sort of, trust among all these Maidan people and civil society. And second, what was quite disturbing, the same Olga told that, well, all the evidence shows that people who were killed by snipers from both sides, among policemen and people from the streets, that they were the same snipers killing people from both sides.
Well, that's, yeah.
So that, and then she also showed me some photos. She said that as medical doctor, she can, say that it is the same handwriting, the same type of bullets, and
Busted.
It's really disturbing that now the new coalition, they don't want to investigate what exactly happened. So that there is now stronger and stronger understanding that behind snipers, it was not Yanukovych, but it was somebody from the new coalition.
For some reason, the U.S. media didn't think that little detail was worth covering. But wait, I thought the opposition protesters were just peaceful activists who wanted a chance to join the European Union. Well, yeah, that's the official narrative that the U.S. media outlets are peddling. But the real story is far more ominous. It turns out that the most powerful...
And then, of course, he goes into the actual phone call with Nuland, and I forget the other guy's name, discussing who will go into the government. I mean, it's blatantly clear. It couldn't be any more clear. And I love how Kathy's just like, yeah. Oh, what a great, so you agree that it was a false flag. Fantastic. I mean, that's that simple. Now, a 21st Century Wire article points out in 2014, right? So we it's very clear what happened here, but this just simply shows you how the immediate steps that followed, which just solidifies that this was exactly what we just discussed, benefiting the U.S. government, just like it happened within Venezuela or any other locations that they directly stole the gold after these kind of actions. And it says, as the dust settles in Kiev, another money trail has been revealed. According to reports out of Kiev, the U.S. has quietly transferred 33 tons of Ukrainian gold out of the country and back to vaults in the U.S. Presumably, this sovereign wealth transfer would be counted as partial collateral for, what do you know, the fresh rounds of IMF, U.S. Fed, the same thing they do every single time, debt slavery that is currently being organized and dumped into the Ukrainian economic black hole. And of course, remember, from 2014 to 2020, it was just article after article of rampant corruption and murder and assassinations. And, because all that's what happens when the U.S. government gets involved. Multiple inquiries to U.S. Federal Reserve administrators. And then, of course, the point was after that, report deadly danger, and then 24th forward, freedom, democracy. They're not Nazis. It's just crazy how quickly they can just turn the story. And their reporting 10 seconds ago showed you the reality. Multiple inquiries to U.S. Federal Reserve administrators into the location of the Ukraine's gold have, of course, been met with proverbial pass the buck, making tracking the final resting place of those 33 tons is very difficult. But one can expect that the New York Fed is probably the institution who has masterminded the financial heist. Now it says, note how gold flows into New York, but has difficulty flowing back out of U.S. private banking hands, as is the case at the time with the confiscation of Germany's gold. Numerous attempts have been made to take back their gold, which was, 274 tons, apparently. But it says it's worth pointing out here that when NATO sacked Libya in 2011, one of the first items that came into question was, of course, the gold in Libya's state-run central bank. We've talked about this. Prior to NATO's takeover of that country, Libya had one of the highest per capita gold reserves, alongside Lebanon, giving Libya a distinct advantage should it, of course, carry out former Libyan leader Gaddafi's long-term financial transition to the gold-backed dinar. As you can imagine, this is no longer the case. Now, the point, obviously, is that, yes, the moment that became a talking point, weird how suddenly regime change was necessary for freedom. But ultimately, the point here is, no, and also, before I go past it, don't forget that they had the highest per capita gold reserves, but they also had the highest quality of life. They had free education, free healthcare, and easy to look up. Doesn't mean that everything was perfect there, but think about the way they framed it and what happened to these people when the people that was the highest quality of life in all of Africa. Now it has, at least post this, it was selling open slaves. And the very people that was the U.S. pretended they were fighting were suddenly in charge. How does that work? Additionally, like Libya and both Syria and Iran are two of the world's last remaining nation states who both have state-run central banks and gold reserves which fall outside the world's private central banking syndicate. That can't have any factor in all this, can it? The point is clearly that the U.S. government has been behind all of this and is still doing so to this day. Now, what's happening in Ukraine now is exactly like you all know. This is from the New York Times. So suddenly now they're caring. It's not like it just started. Volunteers who would not be allowed anywhere near the battlefield in a U.S.-led war are active in Ukraine. with ready access to weapons that are being supplied by the U.S. government and all the rest of their allies. Some, because of course the point is they don't care. They'll use the worst of the worst, as they always have, against any of their enemies. Everywhere. Moderate rebels, neo-Nazis in Ukraine. It's the same wherever you look. But it says some have wasted money on stolen valor. So pretending to be military and still getting armed and getting funding and getting everything else. Others cloak themselves in charity while also trying to profit off the war. Isn't it funny how if we were saying this in last year, March, that we would have called fake news, even by the New York Times, now suddenly it's a story. Well, now they're allowed to say it, you see, because now they've gotten the nod to go ahead and talk about things in some degree that we've already been telling you for a year. The point is, terrible people have been flocking to this area. Why? Because they're terrible people. Because the military has been overrun by this white supremacy, neo-Nazi, however they're framing it. Because that's not my opinion. That's what they're telling you. If you listen to them, that's what they're saying. Now, there's also this politicized narrative argument about that and the way it's being used all around the world, like the vanilla ISIS psyop. But realize that there's people do exist all around the world. And this is one of these locations where they have been allowed to flourish because of the U.S. government. Here's an example of that. Neo-Nazis leave to fight Russian army. This has been reported from all this. I was going to do a focus on this guy in general and their overlaps with these, Atomwaffen division, all these groups that tie right back to the Azov movement and the Rise Above movement, which is the U.S. arm of the Azov movement, all on the record. The point is, as you can see here, they're now funding more money to Ukraine. All of them, right? That's the point, is Ireland and all the rest. They're now sending more money to Ukraine, despite the obvious reality we know, despite the fact that only seemingly 30%, if that's even reaching the people they say it is, because that's how this game works. It's a transfer of wealth. We're being robbed. And in case you want to look further, I'll always include this, that this is not a new thing. Documents have proven that the CIA has been building this fascist entity since 1948, even before they called themselves the CIA. The Azov movement is a central part of this, but it's much bigger than that. If you really want to understand how this plays, what's interesting is the development in regard to how the thing that was never going to happen because it's fake news is now suddenly the focal point. NATO, right? The alignment with NATO with Ukraine, the encroachment of NATO, the involvement of NATO in the war, all fake news when it first started, but now absolute moral imperatives. That's how this always goes, right? Mission creep. It's not even it's on the surface. NATO is now racing to arm its Russian borders. Like, ask yourself why that even makes sense. Has Russia in any way even indicated that it's ever going to put their statements have been clear that all they're trying to do is just remove this dangerous force. Now, there's been 1,000 examples of how they could have pushed further. The lies about how they were in Kiev the moment this started, all of these arguments, because that's how they wanted this to go. Russia clearly didn't take the bait. They're still not pushing and taking over all of Ukraine. This wasn't an insurgency from the beginning, as all of them framed before we got here. This was meant to be a certain way. Now, whether Russia is designed to take over the world or more than Ukraine, who could possibly know? But the reality is there's nothing that indicates that other than U.S. narrative. So why suddenly now? What's different now than a year ago, 6 months ago? Narrative, that's it. So now suddenly, we need to race to do this because we've increased our pressure. Makes sense, right? But it says, in the coming months, the alliance will accelerate efforts to stockpile equipment along the alliance's eastern edge and designate tens of thousands of forces that can rush to allies' aid on short notice and move meant to stop Russia from expanding war beyond Ukraine. Again, okay, what's the indication here? Is it somehow suddenly now you see evidence that that's what's going to happen? Well, no, it's the same thing that's been happening. You guys say he's always wanted to do that, but that's never been anything made clear or stated or any evidence of that beyond it. Okay, so suddenly now we see the same thing that's always been there, and we need to do something about the same thing we've been saying the whole time. Does that seem honest? Or does it seem more likely that this is just the justification of their next move? Because he wants to take over the world. Well, who's actually saying that? Oh, Ukraine military. In fact, their whole Banderite idea is the ideals they have is that they want to reestablish the white race around the world. That's their narrative, guys. That is the Azov movement. That is the group. What is it, C-18 or is that the right one? I'm forgetting the name of the one group. There's a bunch of these groups there, including the right sector and Svoboda and all these groups that are openly supporting these mindsets. So you can literally point to them going, yeah, we're going to take over the world. That's fake news, though. But then they say Russia's doing it, but you can't prove it anywhere. And which one are you supposed to listen to? The point is they already have 40,000 plus, at least on the record, that are basically on the border of Russia. Now, military leaders this spring will submit updated regional defense plans intended to help redefine how the alliance protects its 1 billion citizens. Okay, what it's really saying is we need more money and funding to this proxy force that we're using against Russia. Nothing's changed. This idea that we now need to protect everyone around the world because Russia's, it's a false narrative. At least on the surface, like other than how we could know what Putin is going to do next. I mean, ask yourself that. Why do they somehow have the insight on what his plans will be? I mean, it's just that stupid. And they just keep selling you on what they know Putin wants. How many times have been wrong? Over and over and over? Does he have cancer? Wasn't he supposed to die? Weren't they supposed to run out of ammo last year? Anyway, going forward, the numbers will be large, with officials floating the idea of up to 300,000 NATO forces needed to make the new model work. Oh, that's why. Okay, why not make it 1 million? That means lots of coordinating and controlling. The bottom line is they're putting up potentially a 300,000 force army on the border of Russia, but that's going to be Russia's fault when something happens, right? Of course. The first tier, which may consist of about 100,000 soldiers, is prepared to move within 10 days. So, yeah, right now, this is probably already there based on how this stuff operates. And is Russia supposed to pretend like nothing's happening? Everything they do is logical. And anytime Russia does something in response, even if it's in response to their actions, it's aggression. It's childishly naive, the way this is played. Sal the Agorist points out something I think is really interesting to consider. I'm not even sure how exactly to place this, in fact, but it's a poll that was done. How should Canada respond to the Ukraine invasion? Vaccinated versus unvaccinated. Isn't that interesting? And what do you know? Everybody vaccinated three more times are super hawkish against Russia, aggressive against Ukraine. But weirdly enough, and it's the exact opposite on people that weren't injected. Now, do not see this as left-right. It is not that. It is completely nonpartisan. I mean, there's a lean, depending on where you are, really. But the whole COVID illusion, it's not partisan, guys. People on all sides of this have been very aware of this from the beginning. They wanted you to think it was partisan. But interestingly enough, down here where it says dispatching military forces, nobody seems in line with this. Only 30% of the vaccinated side, 11% of the other side. And yet it still happens though, right? They don't care what you think. They don't need you to tell them. They'll do what they want. And then in the South Carolina presidential forum over U.S. support for Ukraine, right? So his supporters, the moment they disagree with Ukraine, are bad. You shut up. He basically says that. Right? Because you're not allowed to disagree with it. The point is, you want to speak, you run for office. Well, no, that's called free speech, Lindsey Graham, but I know you don't care about that. Well, listen to what he says here. And then we're going to talk about the other impending regime change, which I think we've seen coming. We've already talked about the Mexico regime change that seems impending.
Biden's been the weakest president since Jimmy Carter. Weakness breeds aggression. Let me tell you why it matters to us. This is the Palmetto family forum, right?
Now, weakness only breeds aggression when you're an aggressive state like the U.S. government. Now, that's important to think about. This mantra of, might, or what is it? Basically, might is right. The idea that if you're strong enough, you can do whatever you want. I mean, that's what they believe. And the truth is, what they're basically saying there is that if we allow weakness, or even like perceived weakness, that somebody's going to push in and take advantage. You know what that is? That's the old Soviet mindset, right? We know that's how they still try to frame Russia, despite Russia seemingly never playing that role anymore. But Putin continually not taking the bait or not responding to Israel bombing Syria, on and on and on, because I argue it's strategically smart to some degree. But what's interesting is they're the ones saying, we can't look weak. We can't not do it because they're going to attack us. Well, is that even what's really going to happen? Maybe. But see, being defensively strong is not the same thing as lashing out and demonstrating aggression. That is ultimately what they keep pointing. This is what they are, guys. I just think that's really interesting.
What did Putin get accused of yesterday? Territorial dispute? The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for the president of Russia
his own audience doesn't want to hear this. They don't buy it. These people don't care, you see. They don't care. They are pushing the narrative because that's their job. And they're going to stand up in a room full of people that support them and act like you're dumb for not agreeing. And that means anybody dumb's not, doesn't matter. His constituents are the 1% or corporation or the lobbyists. That's what his constituent. He does this to make it appear that way, that you're the people he listens to. His own audience doesn't like what he's saying. Same thing with Trump pushing the vaccine. They're boo. Doesn't matter. It still keeps happening.
Of Russia for kidnapping children in Ukraine and sending them to Russia.
Is that what happened? I mean, we literally just read the discussion from the UN. Well, even the UN is going, well, we can't really discern whether or not his parents, some of them got parents' consent. That's according to the UN. And then it will apparently all of them got, according to the UN statements, got parental consent, but then they didn't come back when they were supposed to. And I don't know what the other argument is there. That concerns the hell out of me. But is it a war zone? Maybe they're arguing they can't bring it back to a war zone. That's something the U.S. government would say. Doesn't mean I believe them. But you see the game is being played. And the point is they issue an arrest warrant, despite the fact that the ICC has tried to do this many times to the U.S. and they threaten them. So it's interesting how the U.S. wants to lean into an ICC warrant when it's against one of the people they don't like. But the moment the ICC tries to investigate the long-sought, war crimes in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, everywhere, they get threatened. Like Bolton literally threatened the families of the people investigating. That's not whataboutism. It's just the obvious reality. Now, yes, we should also care about what's going on with Putin and the ICC, but we need to understand how politicized that very entity is. It's just painful how people how people choose to be dishonest about this because of politics, team sport politics.
Do you believe in family values? How would you like that to happen to your family?
So, I mean, what an emotionally ridiculous point. What an undefined argument that a government took a child and, he's just trying to make it personal to act like, I care about children. Oh, well, that makes me mad. Like he's speaking to dumb people that are emotionally worked up about what he just said and likely don't even realize why, but clearly he wants me to be, so I care. That's the kind of people they need. Lowest common denominator.
Oh, just shut up. Get out of here.
And that's what he thinks about people who think for themselves. Listen to what they're saying. They're not going, they're not screaming profanities. They're literally just challenging what he's saying. And now you're terrible because you don't think what I think. Here's where he argues you don't have free speech.
If you want to speak, go run and get elected.
Nope.
So here's the deal.
Yeah, he's flustered.
The Putin, I am really conservative. If you believe in family,
see, they're accusing him of not being. Now that's a lot of the rhino arguments. The point is that this guy's a liar, and so too are all of them. Which I hope eventually the rhino patriot kind of thing they see that it's not just some of them. It's the government. Either way, I think it's on the right track. Some of them are dishonest, but it's really all of them. But just think about this. This is in his territory. His own people. They're losing everything right now. We need to take advantage of this.
Stand up for families everywhere, right? Don't you think God made us all in his image? If Putin gets away with this, Tony, there goes Taiwan.
Oh, my God. See, whatever. I mean, I don't even, does that even need comment? So what his argument is that if Putin gets away with, which the argument is what? The taking over Ukraine. Is that what's happening? Is that what's going to happen? Like arguably he's taking the areas. Now, if he takes over Ukraine, well, then you could go. The bottom line is he's arguing that's going to somehow incentivize China to take Taiwan. Well, wait a minute. Taiwan is part of China and Taiwan has not declared independence. I support Taiwan's argument, ability to declare independence. That's not what's happened, though. The U.S. government does not just get to step in and just declare things the way they want them to be. That's dumb. And that is completely irresponsible. And in fact, anybody that supports that is supporting authoritarianism under the guise of freedom and democracy. Think about how stupid that is. But his argument is just, well, if we don't do what we want, other people will do what they want. Yeah, a little too on the nose there, buddy. I don't think these people are so out of touch. I don't even think they realize how people see through them. But here's where it goes. The point I wanted to get into is this is the same person right now, the same hawk, as it's on the 7th. He is literally going, at least he's saying he's going to introduce a bill to set the stage for the U.S. government to use military force in Mexico. Think about the belligerence of this kind of a statement with an ostensible ally, really, that borders your country. This is what he's saying. Think about how dangerous this is and how this translates to everything they're doing. And if this kind of person thinks they can get away with saying something like this, think about what they're actually doing. Lindsey Graham on Monday said he was prepared to introduce legislation to set the stage, his words, for U.S. military force in Mexico. It's all based on these ideas of people being kidnapped and so on, which, by the way, is completely involving the U.S. government with everything that happens in Mexico, by the way, in regard to the allowance of certain things, trafficking, drugs, it's intelligence apparatus. I mean, it's very clear how, anyway, not to get too far off the track. The point here is saying it was time to get tough on the neighboring country after 4 Americans were kidnapped by armed men this week. Now, who are the armed men? Do we know that they're not agents of something that we don't want? Or from, like the point is, it could be any number of things. The assumption that it is what they want you to think it is always how this game is played. Now, it could be, certainly could be. It says, quote, I would put Mexico on notice. Then also ask yourself, is there any other, is it only Mexico where this stuff is happening? Or is it just because it's a politicized discussion, because it's on our border and because of the border discussion, the border wall, and all these ridiculous wedge issues that are not necessarily unimportant get driven between us? So 4 people get kidnapped and suddenly you're literally threatening military force on an ally? Yeah, I mean, that is as crazy as it sounds. I would put Mexico on notice, he says. And of course, this means Graham sees himself and the U.S. government as some kind of leader in the sense that they're, controlling. Right? They're the leaders of the world. That they're able to put someone on notice and cast unilateral sanctions. They clearly think they can do that. They're not legally allowed to do that, but they do. If you continue to give safe haven to drug dealers, then you are an enemy of the United States. Well, is that what's happening? AMLO doesn't say that. In fact, he argues the exact opposite. So now it comes down to the narrative that justifies what you want to happen versus what the president is saying he's doing. I mean, again, this is an ally, guys. This is not, think about how ridiculous that becomes. Graham added he would introduce legislation to make certain Mexican drug cartels foreign terrorist organizations. He would introduce legislation that would designate Mexican drug cartels, some of them, as terrorist organizations under U.S. law, which would do, as we all know, set the stage for military force. That's how easy that is. One sign of a piece of paper, and suddenly we're allowed to invade Mexico? Well, because there's terrorists there. That's post 9/11 garbage biosecurity state. They could do whatever they want in their minds because they just simply argue that's there. Is that legal? No. In fact, it's wildly illegal, both internationally and domestically. They don't care. Doesn't matter. And he's openly telling you that. We'll just write this down and then there you go. We'll invade because we do that because we're in charge. Quote, I would tell the Mexican government, if you don't clean up your act, like there's some juvenile, like there's some kid in school, right? Like you're a 3rd grader, you better clean up your act or we're going to clean it up for you. Who is this guy? I mean, he says some of the dumbest things in politics, in my opinion, like really belligerent, ridiculous things that I think he just wants to be, I think he just wants attention, to be quite honest. But I mean, this is over the top. Military action in Mexico would require an authorization for use of military force, according to the Hill. Well, what about Syria? Oh, I guess you guys forgot. Plenty of it. No, they don't need that. You see, that's what we're supposed to say. Legally speaking, they need X, Y, and Z. And then there's 1,000 ways they step over those things and don't do them. But then they go on to say, which would need to pass a divided Congress and then be signed into law by the president. Or none of that, and they just do what they want. Because, rampant lawlessness. Congress would need a 2/3 majority to override a veto. Yeah, that's the written on paper way things are supposed to go. But we're in the world of executive order, of just unilateral military action, of just justifying military action based on necessity in the moment. All the things they actively currently do. But it says former Trump administration Attorney General, William Barr, just to show you this is not one side of the narrative, called Mexico a failed narco state. In Fox News interview, saying its government is corrupt and lacks the ability to deal with the cartels. Quote, we have to deal with this group like we dealt with ISIS. So in other words, what he means is work with them quietly behind the scenes, pretend we're fighting them, and then take advantage everywhere we can. the truth is that he's justifying this just like Graham is, saying that we're just going to label them terrorists. That way we can do whatever we want in their minds based on their broken, unconstitutional, illegal legislation, referring to the U.S. designated terrorist group. ISIS, the group that we can prove they've created and worked with for decades. We have to use every tool. We have to use economic. We have to use intelligence assets, military assets, and law enforcement, and we have to methodically dismantle these groups. I mean, think about Mexico arguing that they need to do something about some kind of problem in the United States. I mean, do you realize how many things trickle down that affect Mexico? Most everything, really. So why would it not be the same logic for Mexico to be like, well, we're going to do something about whatever's happening in Texas or anywhere in the country because it's affecting us. And if you don't clean up your act, we're going to do this and that. Well, because because the U.S. government would call it unjustified and how dare you show some decorum? Don't you have any respect for sovereignty? Right. Because they care about those things, don't they? I mean, just think about how belligerent this is. This is the U.S. government.
Now let's jump to this clip from Whitney, Webb, and Johnny Vedmore regarding the gain-of-function industry.
Today we're going to be going over some history specifically about gain-of-function research, which I would briefly define as high-risk research where pathogens are given unnatural characteristics that often make them more deadly and more transmissible. So the focus of our discussion today is going to be on how gain-of-function research and the pharmaceutical industry have had a historically symbiotic relationship and how this has led to the situation today where big pharma, and more specifically the vaccine industry, have become the main drivers behind this research, with the other main driver, of course, being the military. So to start us off, I'll throw the floor to you, Johnny, so you can walk everyone through the people and events that brought us gain-of-function research well over a century ago.
Yeah, thank you for introducing me, and hello, everybody. It's nice to be here on CHD TV. There's been a big event happen over the past few years that has shaken everybody, but nearly every generation experiences such an event as well. Pandemics historically over the past 150 years have been a regular occurrence in our history. And so I had to go to a different place than most people go. As the type of research I do, I like to go to the areas where no one else is talking about. And during COVID, of course, there was lots of people who were talking about COVID-19, the current lockdowns, what was happening at the time. There was BuzzFeed emails released and other things that gave us clues to what was going on behind the scenes. And we knew that we'd be able to see a lot of it eventually, but it takes a bit of time. So I started going back through the history. And first of all, seeing as I'm British, I decided to go through the people who were really responsible and tasked with dealing with large parts of the COVID response in Britain, and as Jeremy Farrar, head of the Wellcome Trust in America too. And those rules that were put in America and Britain, of course, and the administrative systems that were put in were copied and pasted through many countries around the world. So in a sense, it was kind of like administrative colonialism that you saw. So I decided to look at a certain group of people who were really heavily responsible and behind the scenes were the main movers and shakers on the COVID scene. And what I discovered is that you go back to the mid-90s and you see that there was a Wellcome Trust project happening in Oxford. And this was during a very special time where the Wellcome Trust was actually merging. It was Wellcome PLC before. And Glaxo had set up a merger with Beecham's, SmithKline Beecham's, and the three companies were going to merge into each other. And from it came the Wellcome Trust, which was a non-profit entity, seen as this was the first time that the Wellcome PLC before had been a money-making enterprise. So this was something else that was bought out of it. And GlaxoSmithKline was born from it, from a merger of SmithKline, Beecham's, SmithKline and Beecham separated, of course, and SmithKline became GlaxoSmithKline. And this was all done under one man called Richard Sykes, who's a very powerful man. He also helped just after this merger, these mergers happened. He helped to coordinate a lot of the new way of sharing medical papers and research papers with each other. So a lot of what we got today on the internet and how people research things and look at research papers was kind of set up by Richard Sykes economics, and a process in the late 90s. And all of these people I found very important. But I also saw something very key, that they were on a journey. They were just one step in a much longer event that was leading to the modern medical establishment trying to create an atmosphere where they could get back to gain-of-function research like they used to in the past. Now, gain-of-function research, of course, is about exploring viruses and virus outbreaks. And a lot of the time, in the past, they would have to go back. They would have to go onto the ground, and they would have to be amongst the people who were infected. And they would have to test out all of their different methods. And these methods came from, of course, 200 years ago. Jenner was the person who discovered the smallpox vaccine by using cowpox, cutting people slightly and infecting them, and it stopped them getting. It was cowpox virus is called vaccina, so I believe that's where the name come from. So if you go back a few hundred years, so that's about 1796, you start to see that people were they felt blessed. They had this opportunity to get rid of a disease. And that idea that man was taking hold of viruses and diseases and fighting back against them was inspiring to many, many people. And I found myself going back through time, not only through modern gain of function, but going all of the way back to where in the 1800s, the response to people who didn't agree with vaccination, because there were still anti-vaxxers back in the 1800s who were saying out loud, we don't want you to cut open our children. Some of them were saying things like, you don't want to spill the blood from Moloch and things. And there was a lot of misunderstanding about it, but there was also a lack of information. So basically, there was a period where you see that there was a response to people who were anti-vaccines, that they were outside society, and that people who were doing gain-of-function research and who were looking to create new vaccines for new diseases didn't want these people to be within the actual discussion, the conversation at all. They wanted to keep it outside. And eventually, this led to an atmosphere where a lot of different countries started to compete. They started to, you saw bigger medical organizations and better organization lead to a much wider sort of attack strategy. And this came to a head in 1910, 1911, at least in my opinion, with an international symposium, China's first ever international symposium on pneumonic plague outbreak that happened during the time. And a lot of the many different heads of different countries' medical institutes came to this symposium. Dr. Wu, who was in charge of the Chinese response to this Manchurian outbreak, was a very influential figure throughout medical history. It included someone who had invented the N95 masks, which are still the gold standard today, amongst many of the other administrative methods of dealing with pandemics. And he wanted help. He saw this as a brilliant opportunity to bring the international community together. And he was a very interesting man in that sense. And he called out to each of the major countries, and each of them sent their candidates. Russia sent a man called Danilo Zabolotny, who was the head of the Women's Institute for Health in St. Petersburg, I believe it was. The Americans consulted with the Rockefeller Institute, and the Rockefeller Institute decided to send Dr. Strong over. He was a very interesting doctor who was studying microbiology and diseases in Manila. The British sent a man named Reginald Farrar. You may recognize the name Farrar from, of course, Jeremy Farrar, who's going to be the head of the World Health Organization, was head of the Wellcome Trust, and whether they're related is yet to be found out. But he was the Board of Health of London at the time. And these men came to the symposium with really an idea of getting as much information, as much data from an actual outbreak as they possibly could. And they did a really good job of doing that. They had basically been given the right by China and Dr. Wu to test on people, to test their vaccines, their prophylactics, and they invited people from all around to test out these medicines on people. The outbreak was vicious. It had affected parts of Mongolia and Manchuria. It was spread quickly, but was easily trapped by people being subjected to staying in their houses. 60,000 people roughly got infected with pneumonic plague, and nearly every single one of them died except for 3 who were horribly scarred afterwards. So there was obviously no successful prophylactic or vaccine found, but they still looked anyway. Now, Danilo Zabolotny, who was the Russian candidate, was famous for trying to cure himself of cholera by taking literally drinking things that were infected with cholera and taking things in his mouth. He once sucked out some sputum out of a young boy's throat to try and see if that would vaccinate him against whatever disease that child had. He was a very famous, interesting man, and all of these men were obsessed. They were obsessed with something that had just become possible, and that was gain-of-function research. That was giving the people the ability, these medical professionals, the ability to really focus in on, you could say, curing people, but really what it was about esteem. It was about getting to be successful as soon as possible and as quickly as possible. And one of the people who came along to this was a Japanese microbiologist called Kitasato Shibasaburo. Now, in the following years, China, in that very year, 1911, would be installed with the last emperor of China, who was, of course, would mean Japanese rule would be over a lot of the Chinese population. And Kitasato Shibasaburo used diseases and used the Chinese people to test on. So during his time in power, he used gain-of-function experiments and infected entire towns and locked people in. And if they tried to leave, they were killed by guards. The gain-of-function back then was a really, a really dangerous game where lots of people died. And in this Manchurian outbreak in 1911, they even got some prisoners together and said, listen, you're on death row, you're going to die. Let us test out our vaccines on you. Let us test out our prophylactics on you. And if you survive, you can go free. So you can imagine how many people died during this period. Now, during this period also, there were interesting administrative issues installed, but really this was about a time where a lot of very, very scientists who were backed by wealthy backers were coming all to one place, and they all had this one idea: try and find out how to harness this disease and make it work for them. And after this birth of gain-of-function research, the consequences within 4 or 5 years, you could posit that things like the Spanish flu outbreaks and other things were potentially due to this sudden rise in gain-of-function, and it was reckless at the start. That led through what we see today is really bears much similarity to what we see in the past. And I don't think people realize the gain-of-function experiments and technology has been available for 120, 130 years. And the people in power have been using and experimenting and trying to get ahead of their competitors to understand these viruses. At the same time, they're possibly creating more viruses that need to be created. This of course, is what we're experiencing now. In our belief, my personal belief is that the Wuhan Institute and all of these other different agencies, they're all doing gain-of-function experiments. They're all looking to find something before somebody else. And all they're finding is death.
Basically, from what you've said, it sounds like we talked about earlier, that this gain-of-function stuff goes, hand in glove with a lot of the treatments being shopped around as, remedies for these particular viruses on which they were experimenting, right?
Yeah. There was one guy, Halfkin's prophylactic he created, and he went over to Manchuria to plug all of his prophylactic to the people. And everybody said, if you took Halfkin's prophylactic, you were probably more susceptible to getting the disease than you were to being cured or immunized. These guys did not know what they were doing. It was like a free-for-all on the Tarabagan marmot, of which the pneumonic plague that was affecting the area had come from. So the tests were just, they tried everything. People who were basically sitting, dying in a hospital bed, and scientists would come in with a mouse, stick the mouse in front of them, they would cough on the mouse, and then they would take the mouse, and they discovered that every single one of the mice died. And from that, what did they gain from it? Well, this is very deadly. Yeah, you can see that out there. What can you gain? Well, we can always put this virus into attenuated in alcohol, make it attenuated in alcohol, and then we can test on it in a lab. And if you see the pictures of what their labs were like back then, they were literally outside with rabbit huts and just big suits on, but just using normal materials. It wasn't really the height of technology, but it seems that as gain of function technology has increased over time, I mean, those were the very early days, but they could still do a lot of damage, and they didn't have the control measures in place to stop that damage from getting out. Now, as the technology has increased, so has the amount of viruses that could come out, so has the risk to our civilizations, and so has the ability to create really deadly viruses.
All right. Well, with that being said, then, as far as my expertise on this topic goes, most of what I've talked about as it relates to gain of function is stuff going on in the 90s and leading up to the 2001 anthrax attacks. And so what's interesting there is that, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, a lot of the big drivers, or really the two main drivers of gain of function research, you have militaries and then you have the pharmaceutical industry, right? So in the case of the anthrax attacks, you actually have both. So the vaccine company involved in the gain of function research that preceded the anthrax attacks was known as Bioport, and today they still exist, but under the name Emergent Biosolutions. They reformed in 2004, and people might have heard their name during the COVID era because they were the people that were tapped to manufacture a lot of the COVID-19 vaccines domestically in the United States, and they were pretty controversial in the way they did that. I think they actually ended up having to have hundreds of millions of doses they produced destroyed because of poor safety and quality controls at their factory, which is something that if you actually look at this company back to their Bioport days, is consistent throughout the entire history of the company, and they continue to get government contracts, decades after the fact. So as far as the anthrax attacks go, what's a lot of people don't know about it. So, there's the official narrative, right? That, there was Bruce Ivins was the guy that did anthrax. But if you actually look into it, or, for example, follow the work of Dr. Merrill Nass, you will know that Bruce Ivins, there's no way he did it. And he definitely, if he was involved, did not act alone. And it looks more like he was framed for the crime of the anthrax attacks, because as people may remember, the anthrax attacks was originally blamed as sort of being the result of a team up between Iraq's Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda operatives. And then it quickly was revealed that the strain of anthrax used in the attacks was the AIM strain, which was controlled, by the U.S. domestically. It wouldn't have been accessible to Iraq or Al-Qaeda operatives. The main facility that controlled access to the AIM strain was called Battelle, specifically their facility in West Jefferson, Ohio. So that's important because in 1997, the Pentagon was creating plans to genetically engineer a more potent variety of anthrax. And this was justified by them because they said that Russian scientists had published a study that had found that a different genetically engineered strain of anthrax was resistant to the standard anthrax vaccine, at least in animal studies. So that standard anthrax vaccine dates back to Fort Detrick, when it was, sort of ad hoc developed by people at Fort Detrick themselves for their own use. And then later on was being developed by this facility in Lansing, Michigan. And this company that's was very much tied up with the military industrial complex. One of the people from the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Reagan was put on the board. And this group of German Lebanese businessmen basically came together to take over that Lansing facility, and that's how Bioport was created. And the name Port actually is throws back to Porton Down, when during the Thatcher era, part of Porton Down was privatized off, and that remnant of Porton Down became the port in Bioport, and its sister company Dyneport, which was a team up of the same Porton Down subsidiary and Dynecorp, for people that are familiar with that particular contractor and their shady history. So anyway, in the late 90s, then the Pentagon, and it has since been, admitted, and even after 2001 was admitted, was basically trying to create a form of genetically modified anthrax, and this was being overseen by Battelle at their West Jefferson facility, and the man leading that was a guy named Ken Alibek, who was actually a defector from the Soviet Union, and I think was the number 2 guy in the Soviet Union's bioweapons program. And when he defected in the early 90s, he was debriefed by a guy who was from Fort Detrick historically, named William Patrick, who, if you ask me, for my pretty extensive investigation of the anthrax attacks, was probably the person most responsible. So Patrick was also involved in this particular program going on at Battelle, which, as I mentioned earlier, was controlling access to this AIM strain. And they also ended up at one point sending it to Bruce Ivan's lab, which is probably, the main thing that they used to pin this attack on him. And specifically, they were trying to genetically modify anthrax to be more potent. So, a deadlier version of anthrax. And this was all justified as necessary to improve the effectiveness of the existing anthrax vaccine. But it's important to point out that before this time and also after this time, the anthrax vaccine produced by Bioport has been extremely controversial because it's numerous doses and has been linked to all sorts of adverse events. Most specifically is believed to be the cause behind Gulf War syndrome because so many troops were injected with this vaccine that had essentially no safety testing in the early 90s en masse. And that is the same vaccine that Bioport took control of in the mid 90s, give or take. So what's interesting too is that why Battelle and the Pentagon are collaborating in developing this weaponized anthrax strain. Bioport itself enters into a contractual agreement with Battelle, which gave Battelle immediate exposure to the Bioport vaccine. And so it was being used in conjunction with these Pentagon gain-of-function experiments. And then what do you know? The anthrax attacks happen, and Bioport's whole anthrax vaccine program is magically rescued because everyone all of a sudden with the anthrax attacks wants an anthrax vaccine. Whereas before the anthrax attacks, Congress was actually going to defund Bioport, and the Pentagon was going to look for another company that would supply them with anthrax vaccine that wasn't Bioport, because they were so awful and had been caught basically defrauding the Pentagon instead of using money that the Pentagon was sending them to fix their facilities, which had been shut down for poor quality controls and safety issues. They were, refurbishing executive offices and stuff like that. So, all of this stuff magically resolves Bioport's problems, and there's a major effort to keep Battelle out of the news. But if you look at the people that were involved specifically with these experiments, people like Ken Alibek and William C. Patrick, there's a very disturbing New Yorker article about them a couple years before the anthrax attacks called The Bioweaponeers. And they're essentially laughing about how fun it would be to release deadly diseases on the people of the town that live below William C. Patrick's house. They're being interviewed by this journalist on the porch of William C. Patrick's home and looking down on this town in Maryland. They're like, oh, I wonder what, deadly virus we could release on that town so easily. And I mean, it's just, they're like crazy people. Ultimately, I would really encourage people to go and read some of those articles because it's quite a trip, to be sure. But essentially what you have in the anthrax attacks is that you don't just have the stuff going on with the Pentagon and this broader thing of, the simulation, for example, before the anthrax attacks called Dark Winter, that predicted essentially the initial narrative of the anthrax attacks that sort of got a wrench thrown in it when it was discovered it was the AIM strain. You have, that aspect and the Pentagon aspect, but you also have the pharmaceutical industry through Bioport being there and trying to get, sort of promote the same dangerous gain-of-function research going on at Battelle to benefit its floundering vaccine program they were about to lose.
Yeah. There's some really interesting stuff about the idea of public and private and how there's a flip that happens to get away from responsibility.
Next, let's take a look at this clip with Ryan Cristián interviewing Derrick Broze on the ongoing child abuse investigation in Utah.
Hey, thanks for having me on, brother. I appreciate that, and appreciate everybody who has been following along with this coverage. I know it's been sometimes difficult and gruesome, and even the details are kind of tedious, but I do appreciate everybody who is keeping up with us in this important story.
Absolutely. And I just want to make sure people see this right out of the gate. And I keep this updated based on Derrick's recent coverage. This is the page. Well, this will be in the show notes for the overall investigation. And the term coined actually by, oh, pardon me, something hurting my eye all of a sudden, coined by the Utah Police Department, the Utah they're the ones, my point, calling it ritualized sexual abuse. And this is the Utah Ritualized Sexual Abuse Investigation. So far, Derrick has written 8 different parts, and we're discussing today the update in regard to David Lee Hamblin and what has his arrest, as well as some new charges. So go ahead, Derrick, and start wherever you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just kind of briefly recap. I do want to encourage everybody to go check out that page that Ryan just showed with the previous 7 articles, as well as the number of interviews. We've probably done 7 interviews as well with every one of those articles on TLAV. So if you need to get caught up, go ahead. There's a lot of details, especially in terms of the sort of side investigations. Like that one went into the ritual abuse in Utah in general. Then we did one focused on the history of ritual abuse within the Mormon Church, which is, largely in Utah. And then part 6 right there was about the alleged satanic panic, where we published for the first time in almost 30 years this report called "Are the Children Lying?" that is related to the claims of satanic ritualized abuse going back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So I say all that to say,
on that note, really quickly, I just want to make sure people think I'm actually kind of blown away by how, I mean, we see this everywhere today, and in pretty much every topic where the evidence is presented, it's about as clear as I've ever seen it in my lifetime, and yet nothing changes. People argue about it, and it keeps going forward. So on that same note, you have done some great work on, like, this in particular, right? Releasing things like this that have never been before seen on the internet. That's really important work that just gets no attention. It kind of blows me away. So I hope people will take the time to go through this information and look at these old reports and the point being today is vindication, as far as I can tell, showing some of the things that have been disputed are now very clearly being vindicated. So I hope people will think about that and go back through these other parts and realize how much of this story is very easily proven that is still being disputed. And then one more thing on that note, since you mentioned the Utah part of it, his work did actually spin off into a specific focus just on the Utah church, right here. Or no, that's the same one. Do I not have the link for that? Oh, it's right here. And here's the page just for his focus investigations on the Mormon church, excuse me. And so I just want to include that as well, because that's its own extensive research we're not going to get into today, and there's multiple parts to that. So go ahead, Derrick.
Yeah, that one does relate to like I said, I mean, this announcement in May 2022 that the Utah County Sheriff's was investigating ritualized child sexual abuse taking place in 3 different Utah counties going back over 3 decades. That led to, this main investigation, which is what we're talking about today, with the arrest of David Lee Hamblin, this disgraced therapist who has been accused a number of different times, including right now, and charged numerous felonies in different counties for sodomy of children, rape of children, etc., that we're going to get into. But that led me down a road of people reaching out, people like yourself maybe listening, sending us information. So we were able to publish that story that Ryan just showed, Are the Children Lying, on the internet for the first time. And that also led to the previous report there, Justice Delayed, which allowed us to publish an investigation to former Mormon church leader Gordon B. Hinckley, which had never been published on the internet before either. So definitely very proud of that work and hope more people will check that out. So in terms of the updates with David Lee Hamblin, this man, again, you're going to have to go back if you want to get the full context. But as I mentioned, in May 2022, the Utah County Sheriff's says they're investigating claims of ritualized child sexual abuse. The next day, the local county attorney, David Levitt, says that he has nothing to do with this. He's not a pedophile. He's not a cannibal. Neither is his wife. And everybody sort of wondered what the heck he was talking about. He then passed out a 150-page document to the local media. Myself and other journalists, we ended up getting a copy of this, and as well as plenty of other documents. And what it related to was a 2012 case against this therapist, David Lee Hamblin, the man we're talking about today, who now sits in prison and was just last week granted a $100,000 bail. He was arrested on similar charges in 2012. He had been admitted to abusing his own daughter. Several of his previous patients said he abused them. He also had lost his license in Utah. So there was plenty of evidence around this. But in 2014, that case against him was dismissed without prejudice, meaning it could be brought back, as it has been now, although the two cases are not identical, they're very related. And this was not because the case wasn't dismissed for lack of evidence, but because the prosecutor said that they were having trouble getting evidence and getting information about that they needed to prosecute this case. And because of that, they were eventually forced to release him because they couldn't just hold him for nothing. And that was 2012. So it's those documents from that previous court case that myself and plenty of others were looking at. And I personally chose not to write about it because I didn't want to write about something that has only been accused of in court and the man was let go of. So for all we know, it could be totally false. And, I don't want to be irresponsible. But so that's when my investigation began. But then in September of last year, 2022, they did finally arrest David Hamblin. And that's when we became aware that, yes, this is all focused on him. Again, not the same charges from 2012, at least not identical, new charges, new victims, etc., in multiple counties, but the same man. And so far, they're just alleging the sodomy, the rape of children from his role as a therapist, taking advantage of his patients. But again, in 2012, he had been accused of by one of his daughters and by several other people, and detailed incidents of more than 150 pages of being involved with a network of people in the Utah area in these different counties that were conducting various forms of ritualistic abuse, including praying to or using the word Satan and Lucifer and stuff while doing the abuse. Make of that what you will. So that was in 2012. And now he's been held on, as you can see there, about 7 different charges, 6 right there, 6 charges for child abuse. And this is going on in multiple counties. And the thing about this latest announcement, Ryan, with this bail hearing is that Hamblin, one judge had already, and I didn't report on this because I was kind of waiting to see how it developed, but Hamblin had already been given approval to get bail from one of the other judges in a different county. This hearing just last week was basically a second judge deciding if she agreed with that. And if she agreed with that, then ultimately that would allow him to get out, because now both counties that are holding him on different charges have said, okay, yeah, we'll let him out on bail, as opposed to one saying he can get out on bail. And okay, what's the point of that? Because the other one's still going to hold him, right? Now, as of last week, this judge, Mandy Larson, said that in San Pete County, Utah, said that he could be released on $100,000 bail, either cash or bond. And there's multiple stipulations and things like that. But that's pretty much where it was. And, it is justice in one sense that he is behind bars at the moment. But as I quote in this article, and as we can get into in a moment, many of the victims are not feeling any, very safe right now that they know that he is potentially going to get out. He might not have that money himself, but in the past, he has proven to be able to get out large sums of money. And in one case, this comes from our own reporting, some of that money is coming from Eldon Talley, who is the ex-husband of Kate Talley, who we reported on previously in our series, Kate's Story, who is a previous associate. So I say all that to say that Hamblin himself is a disgraced, broke, wannabe medicine man who's accused of sexual abuse. Doesn't sound like he's got a lot of financial resources, but somehow he seems to come up with money, and it seems to be that he does have wealthy friends.
Yeah, I mean, it's really disconcerting to see, especially with the, contrasting it with other types of crimes that are, cannabis charges seem to have more restrictions on whether people can leave. Like the idea that this person, whether a flight risk or not, is at least accused, and multiple, people close to him writing testimony about how he abused them and violently and otherwise, that he's a risk to these people, as well as the fact that the idea that this is a risk to other people that, could be new victims and so on. Like, it just kind of blows my mind that this is even something that should be discussed. This kind of criminal, whether accused or not, should be, well, I shouldn't say it like that. Like, accusations are one thing, but when you have that much evidence around the accusations, a judge should know better. And this really concerns me about why that was happening this way. I think everybody would probably be on the same page in assuming that this kind of person would logically be held because of the evidence. And I wonder whether there's more going on there. And to the money part of it, I mean, to your point, there's a lot of obvious connections this person has to high level people. And that's concerning for this, especially if that ties to, as we know from things like the Epstein conversation, this is not just typically one person. These are networks, and that would behoove them to keep this quiet, so that concerns me.
I agree. And there are definitely, I'll say from some of the sources I've spoken to, people close to this case, who feel like, without evidence at the moment, but who are starting to get a feeling that there's something not right with this trial, which is what we suspected from the beginning, that could be a possibility. We've been holding out hopes that the Utah County Sheriff's Office they did their part, right? They made the arrest, but they're not the ones who prosecuted, right? So you still got attorneys, you still got the judges. There's plenty of other ways where corruption could seep in, and you know, even if the well-intentioned cops made the arrest and are hoping more evidence comes out that they, you know, through their investigation, there's still other players in this. And so there have been some questions as to why David Hamblin, who was arrested in September, it's been 6 months now, and at the hearing that I attended virtually last week, the prosecution, which includes the Juab County and Sanpete County attorneys, as well as the victims' attorneys, are still asking for the court for discovery to get documents related to the case, right? And so they were in the hearing, they were telling the judge, we're asking you to hold him, do not let him out, because my victims are, you know, they want to exercise their right to a speedy trial, because I think this is probably everywhere, but I know for sure, based on my research, it's in Utah, that not only does the person who's been arrested and accused of a crime have a right to a speedy trial, which is our constitutional right, but the victims, the alleged victims, have a right to say, like, hey, I want a speedy trial. We can't drag this out for 3 years. Like,
right.
Let's get, you know, down to it. And so the victims' attorneys were saying, hey, my victims are asking for a speedy trial. They don't want him to be let out, and let's move straight to trial phase. So that we can get information out. But they were also discussing how they still need the discovery phase to get documents related to just Hamblin's practices, his medicine, his alleged healing circles and things like that. And for some reason that hasn't happened, even though he's been arrested for 6 months. And that it could just be a slow process, right? The legal system moves sometimes very slow. But again, with somebody who has now at least 12 different charges in multiple counties for one of the worst crimes that anyone can think of, abusing a child, not just one child, but many children, including his own children.
Right.
You would think that they would want to get to the bottom of this fairly quickly. And yeah, in terms of the bail, the language was specifically that they had to prove that he was a current danger, not like, okay, well, he was a danger back in the 90s or he was a danger back in the 2000s, and that the community, that there was clear and reasonable evidence that he would be a current danger. So a lot of it hinged on like those specific terms that they kind of kept debating around. The judge was like, you've proven that he was a danger in the past, but you can't necessarily prove that he's a danger now. And there was even talk of how in one of the other counties, one of the other victims in the previous bail hearing that I mentioned, she told the judge, or through her lawyer told the judge, that she had been threatened and followed multiple times since coming forward and speaking out about this case. But the judge in this case basically said that, quote, I'm not one to disagree with Judge Griffin, who's from Utah County, with his ruling that there's no evidence that Hamblin was behind these alleged threats to other victims. So ultimately, she's like, you can't prove that he threatened anybody, or that his, somebody connected him, threatened anybody. You can't prove he's a current danger to the community right now. There's not clear and reasonable evidence of such. So I'm granting him this bail.
One problem I have, we live in a society right now that is like timidly stepping around the concept of anything that was deemed conspiracy theory, even whether they realize it or not, like a subconscious concern that, certain things, like from a judge's perspective, there is an obvious history that this story has been suppressed, hidden. I mean, that's what's being proven right now. And I do want to get into that part of it. Like the idea that you have not just the testimony from his own children and so on about how they were abused, but the charges coming from police going back a long time, as we've discussed, and then being shut down and dismissed. And even on the record at the time, people writing that it wasn't that it was dismissed because of lack of evidence, but different factors. And so yet again, it comes back around. And so from a judge's perspective, there has to be a consideration to the idea that there is an effort ongoing to keep this suppressed, which then puts these people right in the crosshairs. Like, that's not conspiracy theory. There's really evidence behind this discussion. Now, that you can debate whether that's clear and reasonable evidence, but from at the end of the day, it's about keeping people safe, right? And so this just seems irrational to me, and I really do question whether there's other influences here, or rather just that they're so afraid to be deemed conspiratorial, or however this goes today, that they're unwilling to acknowledge the obvious right in front of us.
Yeah, it is very difficult to not kind of suspect that there's something going on. And I'll say, and it could be my own bias, but I think it's a factor that is hard to ignore, which is that Utah, nearly every person in that state is part of the Mormon church in one way or another, including judges, politicians, attorneys, cops, So again, not saying that every Mormon is incapable of calling out somebody in their community, or that they can, they're incapable of being impartial or anything like that. But to act as if that couldn't be a factor is also silly too. So, I mean, I think that's something we need to consider. And in terms of the abuse in this specific bail hearing, this new one that we're talking about, this was the second set of charges against David Hamblin in San Pete County, specifically in Spring City. And this young boy, who's now an adult, said that he was abused during his therapy sessions with Hamblin. And I just want to read a couple of sentences just so people, for the sake of just hearing the victim's voice. He said that Hamblin made him masturbate him during their therapy sessions. He said Hamblin forcibly abused him. He said that he would administer religious blessings during some of these therapy sessions, which is where some of that ritualized element comes in. And the victim also said that he did disclose the abuse back then when he was a child. Exactly. And this is specifically from the Utah County Sheriff's Office press release. Quote, but that the concerns expressed were not taken seriously because of Hamblin's standing both in the Spring City community and his standing and membership and involvement in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So again, to act like that isn't a factor where a victim is saying like, hey, I came forward, I spoke out, and because of who he is and his place in the church, nobody wanted to hear me. And then indeed in that same bail hearing, the Juab County attorney, Ryan Peters, and this is all in the article, he confirmed this. He said, the victim, quote, has been telling people his entire life about the abuse he suffered. He even said that the victim's sister and mother provided testimony to the attorney saying that, like, yes, he was telling people about this when he was a kid. So because in one point you could hear the Hamblin's attorneys attempt to argue that this was like the recovered memory kind of thing, that they like to dismiss, like, oh, this is just people making things up after the fact or whatever the case. But in this particular case, they're saying, no, this victim has been telling people for decades and nobody wanted to listen. And now here we are. So just wanted to make that clear.
Which brings to mind the, excuse me, the Are the Children Lying documentary part of this, right? Where, this part of the story I found most telling because this is something that was dismissed back then under the same concept, right? And this was something that was suppressed and not, and also that people were the people that actually gave this, as well as the other video that was given to you personally, the actual, in your hand video that we've, that we have released, that people were threatened because of that they got emails and threats and personal, people stalking them. Like there's so many, the evidence in this discussion is very clear to me. You could argue that maybe Hamblin isn't personal. I think from a judge's, I already made the point. It kind of blows me away that these people are not obviously recognizing the long-term problem that's been here. I again, the fact that they're tied back to the central power there, it's the same thing as realizing that they have concerns about the standing government, whether it's Utah locally or the federal government for a larger perspective. It's the same game that gets played. These judges consider these things. That'd be my point. I just think that it's very obvious this has been suppressed for one reason or another for a very long time. And the whole satanic panic part of it too is just an easy way to shut down these kind of, I would argue, provable allegations.
Yeah, and I want to say one other thing on that before we get to the how the victims responded to this latest bail hearing on the Are the Children Lying? Again, please do go read that and check out the interview Ryan I did afterwards, including the Are the Children Lying actual report. But I want to say that the initial impetus, the reason I did that report and the reason it's called Reexamining the Satanic Panic is because you might remember, Ryan, right before that, ABC News had put out two essentially hit pieces about the, Satanic Panic is QAnon is the Satanic Panic 2.0, but they put out one specifically that was looking at this case and dismissing it as the QAnon sheriff in Utah, when, we're talking with the sheriff's office through their public information officer, and he's saying, like, this is disgraceful that a mainstream media outlet is calling us QAnon when we're simply following up leads and doing investigations based on what people are telling us, what information and information that's checking out, right? So that report, in addition to looking at the Satanic Panic and providing the first internet recording of Are the Children Lying, it's actually the first half is kind of a debunking of, like, look, here's what the propagandists are saying. And I do want to mention this just for future, stay tuned for this whenever the time is right. I ended up doing an interview. I was interviewed by the NBC News senior reporter who wrote that report, who I mentioned in that article. Her name is Brandy Zadronsky. She's a former librarian, and she seems to have taken on this role of basically trying to debunk conspiracy theories. If you look up her on Twitter or anywhere else, that's like what she focuses and obsessed on. I was interviewed privately by her and an NBC News producer about my work on the David Hamblin case. They very much were trying to downplay it. And I recorded the entire interview for myself. I have chosen not to release it yet. I'm waiting to see what they write, if it's about me or if it's about this case. But definitely, we'll update TLAV as soon as we know when that's coming out. I just want to mention that.
I think we can all assume it's going to be at the very least selectively edited. I mean, that's what they do, but call me biased.
Yeah. And that's why I recorded the entire thing, because there's some really, really, really powerful statements made in there. And I mean, powerful in the sense of like, when you hear the way that this woman, again, the NBC senior news reporter, who's probably being paid 10 times what we'll make Ryan in a year, is just the logic or lack of logic behind and the way that they operate laid out and bare is very astounding. So yeah, please look for that. But I wanted to move to the victims, because one really interesting thing is that there has been some organization taking place. There are victims and I guess just people who are following this case who actually organized a protest at the courthouse in Utah during this bail hearing. Now, the bail hearing was in person, but there was some people that were able to be in the courtroom with the judge, but Hamblin himself was remote. He was like kept in another room, but you could watch it virtually. But people showed up in person. They had signs and posters, and I was unable to get some pictures for this article because most of them wanted to remain anonymous, which you could understand. People are concerned about, being targeted for protesting this, but people wanted to go out there and express their voices. And even in the courtroom, apparently we're holding signs. And the interesting thing too, Ryan, on the bail hearing, the virtual bail hearing, somebody, because I don't know how they can have such like moronic systems in 2023, but it's not Zoom. It's some other kind of system that you log into. But apparently the court has no control over muting anybody. So at some point, somebody like unmuted themselves and said, I want to make a point. And the judge is like, who's speaking? And then basically, they found who they kicked them out. And then people were doing different things like changing their names, like you can on Zoom or whatever, to we all know what he did. David Hamblin's guilty, just all this kind of stuff, and so there was different forms of protest taking place during the hearing. And I thought that was interesting to see.
I have a couple quick questions for you. Go ahead, finish your point.
No, I was just going to dive into the other things. So go.
Okay, good. Yeah. Just a couple quick points. One, just on a side note, which is just hilarious to me. Like I hate, it's not the right, it's not like you shouldn't laugh at the circumstance because this is not a situation to laugh about, but you have to, in a facetious or in a macabre way, like laugh about how ridiculous these people are. These are people that are running, running governments or running the country or, whatever state authority. And we're being driven into a technocratic world and they can't even figure out how to manage these really basic systems. And I think it's so funny because, we've been driven to this because of the way they've been operating. And so we've been doing this for a long time. And so even like during COVID, we saw all these people that are like, so confused about how the system, their Zoom calls and unmuting or catching themselves in weird, precarious things. I love it. I really do. Because it shows you how ridiculous these people truly are. Anyway, the point I wanted to point out that, go ahead. I'm commenting.
I was just saying, I think it is important just because sometimes people get in this trap of thinking the technocratic state is omnipotent or omniscient, when really it's like, it's still being, as far as we know, ran by humans at the moment who are very cumbersome and not necessarily tech savvy. So maybe they're not always all as powerful as we might think.
It's always a good point to make. I think it really comes down to that we overrepresent who is in this all. And, if there is an omnipotent group, it's not the size of the government, right? I think most people in the government are less informed than most of us. I really like the media, same thing. They buy the BS, but back to the point. How do you think these people found out about this, other than the people that are aware of the story because they've been engaged with it or are personally affected by allegations or what happened to people in their family? Where did this protest come from? Because the corporate media is not really covering this. How do they know about it?
From myself, from Jenny Hatch, who's another woman who does blogs following this. And there's another investigator that I'm going to mention in just a moment after we talk about the victims, who goes by, he's on Substack, he or she, I don't know, 1830 Goel or Joel, who appears to be another person who's in Utah in the Mormon church, but is, doesn't support this kind of stuff. Obviously, between the three of us, I think we're the ones trying to keep up with it. And I actually heard about some of the bail hearings through those two people I mentioned, and that's how I was. And then, of course, talking with Kate, who gave our story. She's following very closely as well. So, yeah, other than some of the victims who are being kept apprised by lawyers or just keeping their ear to, any news, and even there really wasn't, as far as I could see, any local news reporting about Hamlin's bail hearing, which is kind of surprising because we had been seeing Adam Herberts, for example, local guy in Utah, and others stay on this case, but they didn't appear to do any updates with this latest hearing.
Well, anything. I mean, it's like whether it's a blurb or not. I mean, this is a person with standing. People know who this person is who's being arrested for child. I mean, how that's not covered in local media is mind blowing. I think actually very telling. That'd be my opinion. But if you wanted to get on to, I want to go ahead.
I would just want to get to the victims, just the statements from Kate, and just to mention a couple of things like that. That's pretty much all I wanted to say before I wrap up and share what another piece of the puzzle that I learned from Joel.
Okay. Go ahead.
So this last part of this new article here, as I was saying, like the victims, their attorneys, both the victims in San Pete and Joab County, and then even Kate, who is not directly tied to this case, but I will say from sources I've spoke with, she and others were interviewed by police investigators asking them, how would you feel if David Hamblin was released? So clearly there are people going around and talking to the victims or alleged victims at the moment to find out their feelings. And I thought this statement here was really powerful. This is Heidi Nestel, who's one of the attorneys that was speaking in the courtroom. She's representing some of the victims, and she was trying to tell the judge that, like, look, we should not let him out of jail because he poses a risk to children. And she said, including his own daughter, she said, quote, having that proclivity and that propensity is something that doesn't just go away. It would be an absolute travesty if Mr. Hamlin were released and another child was abused. And I think that is important, that if this man's got decades worth of accusations against him, lost his medical license, his own children say he abused them, all kinds of things, like that's not, we can see, and I think the psychology shows that, like, when somebody's mind goes in that direction, it does something to people when they become an abuser or if they've been abused themselves. Like, it doesn't just stop. So that to me is like that I don't know, just the fact that the judge is making, clearly she's going to make her own decision either way, but I was glad that statement got on the record. And
add really quickly, the point would be that even if it's not true allegations, you could still argue that a person would be, driven to take action against somebody who potentially could put them in prison. I mean, there's a lot of, examples. I think that the idea that it's even possible that a child could be abused, that answers your question right there. Whether I understand like the reasonable doubt, like the evidence needs to be there. But again, sure, I think that is there based on all the history. And then the concern here, I just don't see how any judge could rule to let this person be out personally. I mean, evidence and just personal morals. But again, my opinion. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then we had Ryan Peters, who's the Joab County attorney. He was sort of backing up the statement as well. And he said, quote, I will note that Mr. Hamlin has actually written a book on how to manipulate children. I would also note that since giving up his license, the defendant has engaged what he calls healing circles involving the use of peyote. And that as we reported before about these healing circles through our story about Kate, this is largely how Kate was introduced to it through her ex-husband. She was somebody who said she was abused in the Mormon church, tried to seek help, didn't get help from the church, then through some friends, and eventually, her husband was turned to like, hey, go to these healing circles with David Hamlin, and started to kind of become aware of the whole thing. And we also note that Hamlin apparently gave his young daughters peyote during like when they were kids, and this was discovered during his divorce proceedings. So clearly, again, there's evidence of behavior of continuing to practice getting together with people, healing circles, therapy sessions, whatever you want to call them, and this is often where the abuse takes place.
And it's important to point out for those that aren't familiar with that substance, it's a very, very potent, high level hallucinogen. And the point being is that this is, I mean, you might as well consider this to be like a roofie. Right? Like realistically speaking, if we're talking about an adult who has designs to abuse somebody, to give them peyote at any level is going to incapacitate them to the point to where they're not even aware of what's happening. To a degree, it's debatable, but I mean, it'll
definitely alter their mind. And if it's not something they're used to, and especially if you're in the sort of the guidance of somebody, they could definitely, manipulate the situation, to say the least. Yeah. And I got a really powerful quote from Kate. Again, we've mentioned Kate's story several times. It's linked in this article. I do encourage you guys that this is just a short dipping in our toes in this story interview here. We've done so much more work over the last 10 months now. And if you don't know about this, if you haven't read the side stories about Kate's story or the Justice Delayed investigation into the Mormon church, or watch the Are the Children Lying video, please go do that work and share it out there because it's important. And we published Kate's story, a 2-part story last year. Again, she was abused within the Mormon church as a child, she says, and then didn't find any help within the church, eventually became associated with Hamblin and suffered abuse at the hands of her ex-husband under the guidance of David Hamblin, who basically told him how to abuse her and what to do. And Kate said, quote, "I'm disappointed that Hamblin will be let out on such a low bail. I know many of his victims are feeling unsafe and afraid right now. It's heartbreaking. I'm sad today, but tomorrow I will fight on for so many who have been harmed by David Lee Hamblin and his accomplices." She said that she was encouraged to see that there were protesters there and other people watching online, and that she's hoping that the supporters can, quote, "bring awareness to this case and hopefully justice will be served." So again, some of the victims a little disheartened at this news, but trying to hold on for potentially, seeing him really put away for life. And hopefully, again, as she said, those accomplices, that's what we're still waiting to see, is if there are going to be more arrests. The Utah County Sheriff's Office has made statements at different points over the last year indicating that there would be more arrests, but we have yet to see any, and we'll have to wait and see.
Thanks again for tuning into another episode of the Independent Review. Be sure to tune in next week for more highlights from the independent media. See you all next week.
Foundation profited millions of dollars on the vaccines. Millions and millions of dollars. It's all easy to find. And then once he dumped the stock, then he completely changed his narrative and he started talking about how ineffective the vaccines were and about how the virus wasn't as bad as we thought it was and about it was mostly targeting old and obese people. Like, this is fucking wild, because this is the same guy that through the entire pandemic was talking about how great these vaccines are, and these vaccines are so effective, and they stop the virus, and they stop transmission, they stop infection, and all that was a lie. And he profited off those lies. Yes. And everyone wants to pretend that he's just like this amazing philanthropist. Like, no, he made a lot of money. This is motivated by money, and his entire career he's been motivated by money. Yeah. I mean, he's been a guy who is really good at monopoly, and that was why they went after Microsoft so many times for monopolistic practices. I mean, he's a businessman, and in that time, his business was the business of telling people things that he's not educated in. Right? He's not a scientist. He's not a virologist. He's not a medical doctor.
He's not even a college graduate.
He was this public health advocate on television telling everybody to go out and get this medical intervention that he would profit from, which is fucking wild. It's really wild that it's that transparent, that it's not like multiple steps and shell corporations and it's really difficult to find out where the money's going. It's like, what the fuck is going on? This is crazy how transparent it is. You're not even hiding it. It's right there.
And just to back up what Joe said, here is Bill Gates about a year ago, and he started to admit about the virus, what we all knew, and here it is.
And then at that point, we didn't really understand the fatality rate. We didn't understand that it's a fairly low fatality rate and that it's a disease mainly of the elderly, kind of like flu is, although a bit different than that.
So there he was admitting that the virus wasn't as deadly and as scary as everybody he made it out to be, so he could mandate vaccines that he's invested in. It wasn't. Turns out it was like the flu. Like, it's just really elderly people and people who are obese and comorbidities need to worry about it. So probably we shouldn't be injecting kids with that and healthy young people and giving them all kinds of things. And so here he is now, after he cashed in his stock. This is what he says now after he cashed in his stock.
We also need to fix the three problems with vaccines. The current vaccines are not infection blocking. They're not broad, so when new variants come up, you lose protection. And they have very short duration, particularly in the people who matter, which are old people. And every one of those things is...
So that's what he's saying now. And if I would have said that stuff, they would have taken my YouTube channel down. But now Bill Gates, the guru of vaccines, gets to say it because he already cashed out his money. He got $500 million. Go ahead.
Well, every one of those three things he said would get you deplatformed.
That's right.
Or I said them, which, they did. And we were saying that from day one. We knew it wasn't going to. I said in May of 2020, I said these vaccines are DOA because in the monkey trials, the monkeys that were vaccinated had the same amount of COVID in their nasal pharynx once they were exposed to coronavirus as the vaccinated monkeys and unvaccinated monkeys had the same amount. So there's no benefit for transmission. And yet Gates was saying at that time, and you can look up this tape too, and Fauci, if you get it, you can't pass it to your grandmother. You can't pass it to anybody else. And they knew that was a lie. Listen, I don't know he knew it was a lie. He may only be getting information from one person who's talking to him, but if he was actually looking at any of the data from the companies that he had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in, like AstraZeneca, he would be saying, oh gosh, the monkeys that we paid for in this study, which is the critical animal study that's going to show us whether or not it works or doesn't, it didn't work. So he had to know that. He had to know it. I mean, I'm sure he was waiting every day, getting up and saying, has the monkey study come in yet? Has the monkey study come in yet? Well, when it came in, everybody knew what it meant. It meant that this vaccine would never prevent transmission, which means it is a criminal act to give a leaky vaccine that does not provide sterilizing immunity during a pandemic. Because what you're doing is everybody who gets that vaccine now becomes a factory for mutant variants that are escape variants.
And
it's the same thing as if you give somebody subtherapeutic antibiotics. That person is now a factory for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. If you give somebody a leaky vaccine during the pandemic, he's going to get infected. The microbe, the pathogen is not going to be eliminated. It's going to see into the enemy, and it is going to selectively breed escape variants that can escape that vaccine. And you're going to have a continual pandemic that will never end because everybody is mutating constantly, where we all become mutant factories if you took it, which I didn't.
So no, that is such an important piece of information, because I had that information in mid-2021, and that a leaky vaccine was that's not the thing that you wanted to do in the middle of a pandemic, and that it actually the vaccinated people were the ones who would create the virulent new strains. And now they told people the opposite. So the media, the big pharma-funded media, the people in the government, they told people that it was the unvaccinated that became a factory for new strains of the virus. That's what they were told. And that if you got vaccinated, that would stop you from mutating. It was the exact opposite. Now, I knew that, and nobody else, none of my friends in Hollywood, nobody in comedy, nobody knew that except me, and they thought I was crazy. And now they still think that, by the way. They still think that. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I don't have anything to add. It was all about, blaming the vaccinated. It was about, the unvaccinated, and making sure everybody got covered, that you were intimidated into it, you were gaslighted, you were embarrassed, you were marginalized, you were vilified, and, and then it was, the pitchforks and torches. They were trying to get everybody else